I'd like to introduce our presenter today, who is my colleague, Kimberly Tim. For those of you who do not know Kimberly, Kimberly is a Senior Director of Prevention Education here at EVERFI. She has more than 20 years experience in the college, alcohol, and other drug prevention fields, having worked at both public and private universities. She has authored and managed federal and state grants, coordinated nationally recognized prevention programs, and served multiple terms as the Director Chair of AUD Issues for ACPA. At EVERFI, Kimberly serves as a subject matter expert in alcohol prevention program design and development, application of prevention theory in higher education settings, training and instruction, and methods of evaluation. So the topic today is how do state marijuana laws do and don't change the college prevention landscape. And so obviously in preparation for the wave of marijuana legalization that will sweep the country in the coming months, we wanted to take a look and see what this would mean for schools. So without further ado, I'd love to welcome Kimberly to the webinar and have her tell us what her research shows around this topic. Kimberly, you with us?
I am. Thank you, Michele.
Well, take it away. Thank you so much for joining us.
Okie doke. Sounds good. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to join us here today. Excuse me, I see a couple of familiar folks on the list of attendees there, and I welcome those who have not attended our webinars before and who I have not had the opportunity to meet. But again, I'm happy to see some familiar faces, so to speak, as well. So the premise for today's webinar was really it grew out of our attempt to answer the question as to the extent of the role that changing state laws play in addressing student marijuana use. And inevitably, every inquiry we have received on this topic from our schools begins with, our state is about to legalize marijuana, so what should we be doing? And the fact of the matter is, so I guess the title in some ways is a bit misleading, but as we'll discuss today, the laws of the state where a particular campus is located actually has very little to do with prevention efforts in terms of when they should be happening, or whether or not they should, shouldn't be happening because you're in a state where it's not legal recreationally or medically. But it really does impact in many ways the policy conversation. So the answer is pretty straightforward and can be answered in the first, or will be answered in the first couple of slides. And I'm going to spend a lot of time, though, on the research and implications of the research for prevention efforts and what kind of, as we see the impact of the laws, then what does that then mean? What does that then translate into in terms of how we should be thinking about prevention on our campus? So first, let's start a little bit of the scope of the challenge. And I think it's important to just kind of ground us in some different terminology. And I know this was important to folks, and I think has provided somewhat of a bit of confusion around the topic. But when we look at the first is decriminalization, and many states kind of started with decriminalization. This is where the manufacture and sale of marijuana is illegal, but personal use does not qualify as criminal conduct and can only be treated as a civil infraction. And so this is interesting because this has created a little bit of controversy, because technically I think a lot of proponents of legalization have said, this is only half the answer. As long as the drug supply remains illegal, the business of selling drugs is going to remain a criminal monopoly. So those who are selling will continue to enjoy total control over the market and can potentially still continue to corrupt police, wreak havoc in terms of safety or personal safety of their rivals, pushing products to children, et cetera. And so it doesn't necessarily answer the question, but I think many states kind of dipped their toes in with decriminalization first. And I know I happen to live in a state, Massachusetts, where that is certainly the case. So then legalization lists or abolishes the laws that ban the possession and personal use of marijuana. And this enables the government to regulate and tax marijuana sales. So this is where most states have been moving. The other area is certainly in the medicalization or legal medical use of marijuana, where cannabis or marijuana and its constituents can be used when it's recommended by a physician as a form of medicine or herbal therapy. And so in every state where marijuana is legal, in terms of the legalization piece, someone over the age of 21 can possess up to certain amounts of the product. So there's still, you know, some guidelines and requirements, and the age of use does align with the age of alcohol use, which, you know, can be certainly helpful in terms of messaging. You can still be arrested for selling or trafficking marijuana if you're not following the state licensure and taxation laws, et cetera. So there's a couple of, again, important pieces to kind of consider here. This quote, I think, also helps, you know, to give a sense of, sorry, the screen moved there, that, you know, drug problems are really not going to be completely eliminated as a result of any particular position. And this conversation really isn't about that, because it's about the fact that it's here. We're at a new juncture. We are now in the position to have to choose, or to be choosing, which types of drug problems we will have. And as you'll see in a moment, there is a lot of overlap. And thinking of any substance use in silos is really going to be a challenge. So how do the laws impact, particularly perceptions of risk, and what are the potential outcomes of that? First, these are the states where marijuana is currently legalized for recreational and medical use. And these are the states where it is legalized for medical use only. And so you kind of get a sense, again, if you look at the map, the yellow states and the green states there, where we see this starting to emerge, and more, you know, states starting to move in this direction. I think, though, about the implications. So marijuana use in the past month among those aged 12 to 17 by state. And this is data from 2013 to 2014, and it's annual percentage averages of when those 12 to 17, you know, how they, what their usage patterns in the past month were. So the lowest use, 4.98 to 5.6%, were in states where, with one exception, where it was medically legal. The lowest rates of use are in those states where marijuana remains illegal, either recreationally or medically. Next highest tend to be focused and concentrated in states where there is medical use only. And then one of the highest percentages, I think there was one higher than this, but I think this is sufficient to identify the challenge here, is that the highest are in those states where it's legalized for recreational and medical use, particularly, I think, focusing on that recreational piece. Again, ages 12 to 17 by state. These are the students who have been coming to our campus, that are on our campus currently and have been coming and are now there. The lowest perceptions of great risk of harm in that same age group, in that same time period, are in those states noted here. You see, again, the bulk of these states where there is low risk of harm, lowest perception of great risk of harm are in, again, those states where it's legalized for medical and recreational use. So seeing this, looking at this, it's, you know, interesting. It's an interesting picture, but I think the other very important part of this conversation that cannot be overlooked is that nationally it is federally illegal everywhere. So regardless of everything I just showed on that map in terms of where it's legal, recreational, medical, et cetera, that the federal government still considers marijuana a Schedule I drug. So looking at that information, seeing how risk, perception of risk, perception or increased use, particularly among adolescents, early adolescents, we do see, you know, this bears out in data, some work that Jason Kilmer does, who I would highly recommend for additional real in-depth and thoughtful insights around this. Certainly, if you are not familiar with Dr. Kilmer's work, I highly recommend that you, take a look. As I said, much more detailed. There's a lot, that we can dig into that we don't have the opportunity to do on a short webinar. But did want to point out, one area of the research being done at the University of Washington looks at normative perception. So if you look at actual use, you see the majority, again, 56% have not used at all, and 20% yearly, 7% monthly, et cetera. When that same age group, when students are asked how often do you think the typical person in your age use marijuana for recreational purposes, you see almost an opposite of this. And certainly this is not unusual to those who've been doing looking at this data for alcohol, for example, and spending a number of resources and time creating social norms marketing campaigns. And so the same could certainly be done for marijuana, particularly because the perceptions are really, really, there is such a gap between actual use and perception. So you see 56% that do not use. When you add up the weekly and daily use, that's 53% think that at least weekly use is occurring. And so again, just almost like the exact opposite. So some real distinctions, and that makes sense. Again, looking at the math that I had done on the previous slide, this all fits together from the standpoint of the impact that laws have had on perceptions regardless of the state that you are in. The other question that often comes up is, is marijuana different today? So if we start to think about, as we speak to, we hear a lot from a number of folks, that, well, I did it, or I've done it, or my parents did it, or, I did when I was young, et cetera. And so important to point out in this particular graph, and again, this is something that Jason Kilmer speaks to frequently, is if you look at the average levels of THC over the years, there has been a definite increase. There is no escaping, these differences in how marijuana THC levels have evolved from 1995 to 2014. And then there's a specific challenge that was noted in the state of Washington, not that everybody is there, but because Washington was one of the first states to legalize marijuana, there's been a lot of research done there. And specific to THC, I think it is pretty telling, where you look at the average potency of marijuana nationally is around 13.18%, and in Seattle, it's significantly higher at 21.62. Same goes for concentrates. Nationally, it's 55.85. In Seattle, almost 20 points higher in terms of the THC levels in marijuana. So, or I'm sorry, the concentrates, potency of the concentrates. So really, there's been a lot of headlines around this topic for a number of years that have spoken to what I'll show in a minute, one aspect of the benefits of legalization, but some of these other pieces certainly have been missed in that conversation. When we look at individual impact in particular, looking at the research, and again, there's so much around this, so this is just one slide to give a high level snapshot of what is out there. We look at things like brain function. The THC, changes the level of neurotransmitters in the brain. And so it's important that a lot of this information is understood, that the science of it is certainly understood, not just by individuals doing this work, but a number of folks on campus, certainly, because the issue around the brain function piece is that because of the levels of the change in levels of neurotransmitters, the brain compensates by reducing receptors, and that creates tolerance. So things that a lot of times we hear students say, well, we don't, it doesn't have the same effects as alcohol, but that's certainly not the case in terms of some of the markers that we see around potential for abuse. The other area is health and safety. So things like slowed reaction time that contributes to dangerous driving. It can cause, we see that there is a potential to cause delay in sexual development, to disrupt menstrual cycles, and it can damage the immune system, making folks at higher risk for developing infection, having slower rates of healing from common illnesses, even like the flu or the cold, or a common cold rather. And then also a lot of the work that Amila Arya has done around this issue has certainly focused on the academic piece, the correlation between marijuana use and skipping classes, lower semester GPA, delayed graduation, and dropout rates being higher among marijuana users. And so I do want to dig a little more into some of these pieces, just because I think this is important, particularly for the college environment. Research with college students has shown an impact on attention, concentration, and memory, even 24 hours after the last use. So it does not go away. After daily use, it takes about 25 days for the impact on attention, concentration, and memory to go away. So when students in particular are using marijuana on a regular basis, there's the potential for this impact to not go away. The deficits on verbal learning are no longer significant at 2 weeks. Deficits in verbal working memory are no longer significant at 2 weeks, but deficits in attention are all still present at 3 weeks. So again, this certainly has implications for the length and amount of time that students might be using cannabis. The social implications, certainly decreased motivation, increased legal problems have been tracked, lower achieving, those with higher rates of use have lower achieving in education and occupation, potentially even beyond, not just during college, but beyond if they do attend college. More broadly, beyond that individual level, how does this impact public health? So thinking, from a public health perspective, the social ecological model, how this impacts different areas. So not just individual, so beyond individual, the community, what are impacts, writ large on the society, much more broadly. So, there have been a lot of studies identifying that the use, of course, in Washington and Colorado has been increasing since 2010. They were the first two states, to really, again, step into this area. And so, not surprisingly, the use has increased. Emergency room visits for marijuana are on the rise too, and most of this is due to the mimicking of psychosis and heart attack symptoms due to the potency, and that is particularly the case when it comes to edibles. But so potency, in terms of the more potent the product, the more opposite the effect is. So while students may, the reason for smoking may be to relax, the more potent the product, the more likely agitation, aggression is to occur, and then there's the increased heart rates and narrowing arteries, and this has mimicked a heart attack, sending many individuals to emergency rooms because they believe they are having either a panic or heart attack, so we have seen these things on the rise as well. That coincides somewhat with the accidental ingestion of edibles by children. Edibles now more available, more appealing to children because of the form, for example, the gummy bear type form or gummy form of edibles, or food, again, and it not being labeled appropriately as well. Perception of harm, noted that in the map and the research from SAMHSA that the perception of harm is certainly on the decline. Opioid use is increasing, and some might have suggested that, is this a result of drug cartels having to make up for lost revenue? There have been many, many articles. There was one a couple years ago in the Washington Post where they, talked about, traffickers are sending a flood of cheap heroin and methamphetamine across the U.S. border, and it's a sign that marijuana decriminalization is upending the North American narcotics trade. Of course, proponents of legalization have certainly tried to debunk that. There's a lot of very interesting, data on this that you can trace, and certainly when they've interviewed, folks who are in the business of selling, they have acknowledged that they have needed to kind of fill in the gap elsewhere. And so it certainly is not to suggest that marijuana decriminalization is the reason for, opiate increases in opiate use and heroin overdose, et cetera, et cetera. That's not it at all. I think when we look at multiple contributing factors to that issue nationally, there are those that say this could potentially be part of it. Marijuana drug driving has also gone up significantly, 63% since 1999. Think of how that maps across the increases in levels of THC, for example. At the same time, we've seen drunk driving going down. Again, that tracks with a lot of the data we have on high school and in particular students not using alcohol or delaying alcohol use. But almost half of young adults who have used marijuana in the past 30 days have reported that they drove a car within 3 hours of using marijuana. So that certainly seems to inform some of the trends that we're seeing once again. So what are we missing here? Why, if all of these public health and individual impacts exist, what is the challenge? And I think one of the challenges that's been noted is there has been, in legalization, the conversations and the push to legalize, the focus has been very much on the economics of legalization. And to the point where there's a dearth of information on the public health and individual impacts, that tends to not get the lion's share of attention, or hasn't gotten. What if we replace these headlines with things like, how growing marijuana legalization, could potentially have increased use of opioids or increased visits to the ER, the public health impacts of marijuana legalization, the billion-dollar industry that's created not just new jobs, but also, new challenges to states in terms of education and health impacts, and the money being spent on healthcare and treatment and recovery, et cetera, et cetera. Because while treatment admissions for 12 to 17-year-olds are decreasing for alcohol, they have steadily increased for marijuana. The highest increases among is treatment for opioid drugs, but again, marijuana has been steadily increasing and is higher than that of those seeking treatment for alcohol. So some of the implications then for campuses to touch on, again, I referenced this and have to say it's important to point out that any discussion about this issue on campus has to include the recognition that marijuana is still a Schedule I drug under federal law. So this means that regardless of changes to state laws, institutions of higher ed are expected to follow the regulations outlined in the Drug-Free Schools and Campuses Act, or otherwise known as EDGAR Part 83. And this does include upholding laws and statutes prohibiting the possession, use, or distribution of marijuana by students, staff, and faculty. And to not do so does put an institution at risk of losing or having to repay, federal funds. And even though this legislation has had minimal follow-up, that the federal government has not been necessarily holding campuses accountable, that has certainly stepped up in the last 2 years as they are tying EDGAR requirements to Clery and Title IX audits on campuses. So as part of those audits, they are requesting information on how campuses are supporting the DFSCA. And although the federal law does leave little room for doubt as to the expectations for how to respond, the reality is a little bit more complex. So federal prohibition on marijuana does include even medicinal use, and that's something that schools are grappling with, and there is an assumption even by students and potentially parents as well. We have heard from many schools where parents assume that a legitimate medical prescription is still allowed, even if it's illegal in the state. That is not the case, but that does present some challenges, in working with students, for example, who do have that legitimate prescription. And, do we have things in place on campus to help, them find appropriate housing options, for example, where they can utilize, if they're in a state where it is medically legal. Where even though they can't use on campus, can we as an institution, or do we as an institution have processes in place to, help students find alternatives. And then students who use cannabis to offset the symptoms and side effects of opiate withdrawal, those in recovery from opiates, substance use disorders, particularly around opiates. You know, marijuana is used to minimize those debilitating side effects. And so again, how do schools work within the law to identify some creative solutions to these challenges? And certainly there are others. I just posed a couple of them here just as a point of reference. So going back to, again, what the data tells us. We go back to this map where it's, you know, we see medical and recreational legalization. When we looked at our alcohol EDU data, we saw no difference in use patterns of students attending colleges in states where marijuana is recreationally or medically legal versus those in other states. So if we looked at the green states versus, you know, so schools, colleges, looked at the data of incoming students in colleges in these states, we did not see a distinction. However, where we did see the distinction is in looking at the national aggregate, and what we found is that the percent of students, incoming college students, again, this is over 120,000 students who completed this, incoming students, again, the course, or first-year students, rather, that in recreationally legal states, students who have ever smoked marijuana, 46%. In the medically legal, it was slightly less. And then in states where it remained illegal, there was definitely the lowest use for ever having smoked or ingested marijuana. For past 30-day use, we saw similar trends, although much lower, 24 and 22, almost the same, but then those 15% in those states where it is illegal. So important to understand that it's not where students are going to college that is as much of the concern as it is where they have come from. That being the case, schools that are saying, you know, it's about to be legal in our state, so what do we need to do? These students have already been coming. There's already an issue, or there's already, you know, use increasing on campuses, whether or not the state is legal, because of where students are coming from, because they are so much more influenced by where they went to high school, where they spent their adolescent years, than where they are going to college. Not to say that going to school in a state where it is legal versus illegal doesn't impact a student's decision, but it's likely very minimal. And then, so where it does have the impact is around those policy conversations, as I noted earlier, and that's significant and could be a whole other webinar, and something that many campuses are still grappling with. The other piece I want to touch on is our findings from a new poll. I attended an event last month at the University of Maryland where I you know, had the opportunity, some of you who are actually on this webinar today, I attended with you folks, and what was interesting was the findings from a new poll that were released that was commissioned by the Mary Christie Foundation and Hazelden and Betty Ford Institute for Recovery Advocacy. And I had some interesting findings I want to share, because as this topic, as is the nature of this topic in particular, it seems like there is more information, new information coming out every month. And certainly there's more and more that is helpful, more and more that is you know, meant to help guide some of our understanding of how we approach prevention. And this certainly was one of those examples. And I really encourage you to look this up online to find the broader report. I'm only going to share a few pieces here today, but the survey of campus administrators, 744 professionals, it was sent to, I believe, over 800. So there was a pretty high response rate. And these were folks in academic affairs, student affairs, and student health. And it was conducted between September 4th and 25th of this year. It was also supported by ACHA, who emailed, so some of you may have responded or replied to this particular poll as well earlier this semester. But one of the findings in looking at how things have changed, again, consistent with what I have been mentioning, you know, since the top of this webinar, is that over the past 3 years, the number of students who perceive that marijuana is safe has changed, or the perceptions of administrators, at least, is 54% that say that the perception has increased, of safety has increased, stayed the same, 23%, small percentage say it's decreased, and 22% are unsure. And as you'll see if you read the larger report, the response of unsure is something that comes up in a number of ways and has certainly some additional implications as well. But I think this shows us that prevention and treatment approaches really need to address perceptions of risk. Much like Jason Kilmer's work has looked at, and the data shows that these are things that, although there may not be as much efficacy behind them as for things like alcohol or sexual violence, it is certainly something that we should be speaking to, if not through formal campaigns, at least in how we talk about the issue on campus and with students. There's also a lack of familiarity with the latest science. So this was particularly interesting. So if you look at this, administrators, it really identifies that administrators aren't fully familiar with the latest science, and which may possibly be the result of, again, a lot of information on positive economic impact potentially, and lack of other information being shared, or maybe accurate information. So respondents were asked here whether they agreed or disagreed with a series of statements about the effects of marijuana. So on most issues, you see that a majority of administrators did give answers that were in line. So percent correct means they were in line with the consensus of the scientific research. On issues where the relationship between marijuana use and alcohol, this is where administrators were a little less certain and less likely to give the correct answer. So public health research does suggest, and we've seen it certainly in our alcohol EDU data, that students who use marijuana are more likely to drink excessively than those who abstain. And we also, note for those in particular, we see that 37% gave the wrong answer compared to 34% who gave the correct. And administrators in academic and student affairs were also more likely, even though it doesn't necessarily point to, but they were more likely to answer unsure than those working in health or drug prevention, residence life, and campus safety. So there was a little bit of a distinction between the particular role of the individuals who responded to the questions. And the asterisks simply mean that, agreement with the statement was a correct response on all the items, but where there was an asterisk, disagreement was actually the correct response. So just to help identify a little bit more specifically there. And so what this again shows us is that there are significant gaps in knowledge, but they can be addressed through training and information sharing, especially the impact of use on student health, well-being, and academic success. And this is not just for students, but I think there's faculty, staff, administrators that need to also share in, this information, their training opportunities and the information that's provided, so that everybody is on the same page. And that is reinforced through this other part of the poll, another piece in the poll, which asked respondents how much of a barrier do each of the following present to successful efforts and policies on campus. Everything from that not a barrier to a major barrier, and you see where lack of resources is the number one in terms of major barrier. A lack of information about effective policies is the next one. Lack of coordination across campus departments, and then opposition from students, while it's higher than some, still not as high as the lack of resources and lack of information. And so, as many folks might assume, that the opposition from students is the highest. Now, it is in terms of a minor barrier, but I think it's particularly when we look at the lack of coordination, lack of information about policies, a lot of that traces back to this challenge between federal and state laws, and how is that interpreted on a campus, and how do campuses navigate that distinction. But staff and faculty opposition, while it does exist, is the lowest. And then again, that challenge that marijuana is legal where the campus is located. In addition, 46% of respondents said that not very much emphasis is placed on preventing marijuana use on their campus, and so there is certainly a perception that it is not a concern or an issue, and so that certainly is a challenge. Most respondents were unsure if their campus even collected student-level data on marijuana use, and again, that unsure piece for individuals responding to this, likely faculty, staff, non-health professionals or prevention professionals. You know, that is an important part of this, you know, of a prevention approach, is to make sure that that data is being collected. 16% do not collect it, 14% collect data every year, and then 12% collect every 2 years. So there is some data collection going on, but again, not to the levels that we would hope, and certainly some of the percentages of those who are unsure, it could be being collected, but certainly not necessarily shared. So what are some considerations for creating a college program? And I've touched on a few of them as we've gone through this data, but some other, I think, important pieces of discussion come out of some of the data, again, that we've collected through our alcohol EDU course, particularly the questions around marijuana use. And we see demographics. So this is levels of use by sex. So 34% of males, 30% of females, and 34% of those students who identify as something other than male or female, whether it be intersex, transgender. You know, there are multiple responses there. And so again, you see some of those use rates highest among males, and those who do not identify with the binary construct of male-female. Sexual orientation, again, levels of use look to be higher among bisexual and queer students who identify as bisexual and queer. And we see that in some of other health behaviors, such as alcohol use and sexual violence. Particularly with alcohol use, we see students whose sexuality is in flux tend to be at greater risk and have higher rates of use. So that's somewhat consistent with that data as well. By age, we see use by age, even though this is administered to students who are first year. There are transfer students, there are students who are older at community colleges and such who respond, and so that's why there are age examples from age and variations. And then race and ethnicity, we see rates highest among white and Caucasian students, as well as Native American and Native Hawaiian. And so there are certainly some implications here as we think about the data we're collecting, and are we collecting the right data to be able to identify you know, the particular groups that we might need to you know, spend some extra time with to identify reasons for use, to not make assumptions, certainly based on some of these demographics, and to try to find and understand reasons, some of which may be religious, cultural, any number of things, and to try to address those reasons based on those unique characteristics versus a broad approach. Marijuana still is the drug of choice. This is 2015 data, past year drug use among 12th graders. You see prescription drug use, which is certainly in the national spotlight and continues to be. And even though this is 12th grade use, these are very consistent with our data from our prescription drug course as well, in terms of the use of different prescription drugs in a non-prescribed way. But if you look at all illicit drugs, marijuana, again, is still the drug of choice. The reason I you know, mention this is because even though we're looking at two different graphics, there is data showing the connections here. So looking beyond this piece, if we look at specifically marijuana and stimulant use, which is one of the highest areas, or one of the most highly misused prescription drugs on campuses. So among those reporting no past year non-medical use of prescription stimulants, so those who may be using but are not certainly misusing prescription stimulants, you see past year 30-day marijuana use, and then some academic consequences and how you know, those relate. Now, more importantly is when you look at students who report past year non-medical use, so those who have been misusing stimulants, we look at the distinction, almost 3 times as much, you know, in terms of marijuana use, or 2.5 times rather. Past 30-day use is high, and then academic consequences, particularly skipping one class. You see the impact there compared to those who skip class due to alcohol or other substance use. And so, again, reinforces for us that we cannot address some of these topics in silos, that There's data similar to this around alcohol, the connection between alcohol and marijuana use, which are no longer mutually exclusive, but we do see high-risk use among those who are using marijuana. And so taking the opportunity when a student is documented for a policy violation on any violation of substance use policies, that it is an important opportunity to educate on multiple substances, not just the one they were potentially being held responsible for. With edibles, something that has really gotten attention on a lot of campuses, because they have a delayed onset of effect, and because of that, people consume more of the product. So I'm not getting the effects I want, so I'm going to keep consuming more. It's similar to the biphasic effects with alcohol. I don't feel drunk yet, so I'm going to keep drinking more, and then all of a sudden it hits. And so the absorption, that's because absorption takes longer through the stomach versus the lungs. So edibles have become a real danger, and again, there's been increases, numbers of college students reportedly going to ERs as a result of concerns or sense of having a heart attack or panic attack. So we really do need to highlight the need for this information highlights the need for greater vigilance by student staff and others to recognize those different forms of marijuana and cannabis, as well as the signs of overdose. So it's not going to be, oh, we're going to smell it. We're going to know when someone's using. It's likely now more than ever, you're not necessarily going to have those more obvious signs, and so there is a need to make sure to educate student staff and others who may have interactions with students in living environments. The other piece is, if we look at, again, something that Jason Kilmer points out that I think is a really important piece to note, is if we look at kind of the motivations for use of marijuana as reported by students, like enjoyment, fun, to discount to in response to boredom, or they want altered perception, to enhance an activity, to celebrate, to reduce anxiety, to relieve stress, to enhance food. These are some of, again, the motivations. And it's interesting because if you look at the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual and the withdrawal symptoms that are outlined there, the criteria are anxiety, trouble sleeping or staying asleep, trouble focusing, decreased appetite, etc. So it begs the question, are we treating the symptoms instead of the problem? And one of the challenges there is making sure that we are screening appropriately, right? So do we have folks in health, counseling, and psychological services that are screening for marijuana use? So when a student might be identified as having an anxiety disorder, is it truly an anxiety disorder, or is it mimicking that because there are symptoms of withdrawal? If we're not screening for marijuana use, then we may be treating the wrong aspect of a mental health, or we may be treating as a mental health issue that could potentially be addressed through treatment and identifying and reducing use of a particular drug. In that same poll that I referenced from the Christie and Hazelton and Mary Christie Foundation, campuses were asked if students were routinely assessed for marijuana use when visiting these following areas. So health center wellness visits, mental health visits, counseling center, student conduct and judicial office. You see, again, I would like to see that higher on both counts. I think, those are low numbers for alcohol, certainly, and there is a lot of efficacy around doing the screening in multiple settings to identify and refer based on a very simple 5-4 screening question. There's also a simple way to screen for marijuana use, and again, those numbers are even lower than for alcohol. So 10% of schools have physicians that specialize in addiction medicine or substance use, and 60% of schools refer students with identified marijuana problems to off-campus treatment services, and that's likely because the treatment services don't exist on most campuses. If they do, that's wonderful, but there is a method and a opportunity to refer to off-campus treatment, and certainly we need to be thinking about how we partner with those resources. One of the major challenges is difficulty around identifying parameters for use. So when we were doing some of our initial research last year prior to our research summit, where this topic was initially, where we created our first presentation, which has changed multiple times since then. One of the things that campuses told us is, look, we have a lot of trouble identifying these parameters. So, you know, for alcohol, certainly we have sex-specific guidelines, the 1 drink per day for women, up to 2 for men, et cetera. A standard drink is defined. But for marijuana, these things have not been identified. And so this poses challenges for campuses that choose to create messages around harm reduction, or focusing on harm reduction. And even if you have an abstinence-focused policy or a zero-tolerance policy, there's still a need to help students understand, you know, kind of what are those parameters, and that, you know, prevention and early interventions that address beliefs about minimal or infrequent use can really help reduce the likelihood of chronic or heavy use. And so this is a very important part of our efforts in addressing students who identify with these problems. Now, even digging a little deeper, one of the interviews that we did, one campus had a pretty clear understanding of the casual versus low risk, and you see here, really focused on use less than weekly use, generally in social settings for no real reason. There were minimal consequences related to it, and high risk use had, you know, a number of additional pieces where use was more frequent. There were academics that were impacted, that it was being used to self-medicate. It was being used in isolation. There was an inability to function or perform day-to-day tasks, and was being used to help sleep. So a number of different areas that that campuses were identifying. So this is one way that schools have defined casual versus high risk. Then there are also schools, when we asked, interestingly, how would you define, for example, low risk? Low risk, if we look at our data among students who have ever used marijuana, 38% have not used in the last 12 months. And schools had a variety of responses to what low risk means. And I think the most helpful is probably looking at the CRAFT tool, score of 0 on the CRAFT, which is their use in a car to relax, use alone, use to forget, or forget as a result of use with friends, gotten in trouble. And so that tool has certainly been helpful. That remains consistent in terms of low, medium, and high risk. But many didn't really have an answer. They were pretty much all over the place. Medium risk, data-wise, if we look at students who have ever used marijuana, 13% did so within the last 30 days. And that is kind of the parameters that were used by campuses to define medium risk. Again, there's the CRAFT score, anything of a 2. Frequency and amount and method of use, everything in between. This is a very broad category for campuses. So certainly there is a need to have these conversations as well, because then we look to high risk, and among students who've ever used, 12% report using daily and 8% use alone. Those, so most students wouldn't fall into this category. You see some of the examples that schools have given. Daily use to multiple times a day, never thought about it before, but would probably be quantity, and whether or not dealing is part of it, using alone. This is where campuses start to use the audit or QDIT scores to identify level of risk. And then also considering the particular campus, the specific campus, cultural, you know, kind of influences, or the characteristics of the campus. So a student might score a 7, which may seem low, but at this school, I would be concerned about that. So it may not be just across the board, but in our specific given environment, what do we consider high risk? So these are important questions that should be asked. And as we think about intervention options, some of the things that schools are using most or are most focused on are some tools like ScreenU, which is an online screening, brief intervention and referral tool, and it can be customized. It's something, you look this up online, it's the Higher Ed Center at Ohio State has created this. It's a really well-developed design, fantastic tool. We look to that poll, and 24% of schools are using some type of online intervention like ScreenU, and this provides some really great data as well. So it's another way of collecting information that you may not have. Some campuses are using marijuana intervention meeting, or MIM, which is a group in a group setting, 10-session programs weekly on various topics: self-awareness, personal responsibility, self-motivation, essentially characteristics that research has somewhat connected to students' use of substances, multiple different types of substances. So addressing not just the substance use, but the reasons and motivations for that use. K6, which is the, utilizes the core components of the brief alcohol screening and intervention for college students. It's cannabis focused instead, and it can be used for both college and high school students. These single, and sometimes they're not single, but the initial is single in-person intervention sessions are used by 44% of campuses that responded to that poll. And promising approaches really focus around screening and brief interventions for youth and young adults, and especially in pediatric emergency departments when they are reporting in those settings. But there's also similar tools that are being used for online and in person in a number of health centers on campuses. So this is something that is being widely studied, widely looked at. So in creating your prevention plan, I'll spend the last 5 minutes here looking at, so at EVERFI, the Campus Prevention Network has developed a framework for comprehensive prevention. You can get more information on that here. And this is all based on the research and evidence in a number of different areas that lead to the understanding of what works in prevention. And so it's not just about what does the data say, what is effective, and what was the evidence base say, but this is more a way of putting that evidence base into more of a thoughtful framework to be thinking about how we are addressing a number of different, it can be applied to a number of different areas of campus prevention efforts, whether that be alcohol, sexual violence, prescription drug use, or in this case, marijuana. So institutionalization is the degree of system-wide buy-in and visible commitment and investment that the campus itself, the institution, on the whole, as individuals, as well as more broadly, invest in effective prevention. Critical processes are those strategic and collaborative and research-informed translation of those resources that we have. How does that translate into effective policies and programs? And then policy are how we communicate the values and expectations of the institution and our expectations for the community, the system of accountability to uphold and enforce those expectations. And particularly, are we not just holding students accountable for violations, but are we considering policies that are taking into account students who are not, which is the majority of students, likely to violate policies? What are their rights? And how do our policies support the rights of those students to sleep, to study, to have that academic experience that they're seeking, so that they're not leaving our campuses because we as an institution are not challenging some of the behaviors that are impeding academic success. For programming,